Hello, my name is Marcus Krieger. I work for the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County in Moorhead, Minnesota, and this is a presentation about founding Clay County, how Clay County, Minnesota was founded. First not everybody's from Clay County. Not everyone has the good fortune of living here, so I should tell you where it is. Clay County is on the western border of Minnesota, northwestern Minnesota. I am speaking to you from Moorhead, a city of Moorhead, which is on the other side of the river from Fargo, North Dakota. And it's in the Red River Valley. Other towns in Clay County include Dilworth and Glendon and Hawley and Barnesville and Felton, Ulen, places like that. And so how was this presentation's about Clay County specifically, how it was founded, but it's really going to be very similar to a lot of the founding stories in this part of planet Earth. Okay, so what do we mean by founding? I'm going to talk about four things that we need to found the county. One, we need the land. Two, we need settlers living here. Three, we need towns. And four, those towns and those settlers on that land need to form a government. And that is how, that's what we mean by founding Clay County in this presentation. So, where I live, Clay County, Minnesota, is an ecotone. An ecotone is a fancy science word that means a transitional area of vegetation. So if you go 40 miles west of here, it is definitely the Great Plains, like Castleton, North Dakota. It's the same Great Plains as up in Alberta and Saskatchewan down to Texas. East of the Rocky Mountains is the Great Plains. If you go 40 miles west of where I am, say Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, that is definitely the woods. That's the Great Woods. That is the people used to say that in the 1800s a squirrel could get on a tree in Minnesota and not touch the ground until it reached the Atlantic Ocean. And we are somewhere in between. I'm on the banks of the Red River, speaking to you here in Moorhead right now, and we're where the Great Plains merge into the Great Forest. And because of that, it shouldn't be surprising that historically we are where the people of the plains meet the people of the forest. And I'm being simplistic here, but you can go a lot deeper into it, but for our purposes, the people of the plains are the Dakota, and the people of the forest are the Ojibwe. All right, so the Dakota. Another name for Dakota is the Sioux. Other people call them the Sioux. The Ojibwe call them the Sioux. They call themselves the Dakota. The Dakota means the friends or the allies. Who are the allies? The allies are the Oceti-Sakowin. That means the 7 council fires. 7 bands or groups of people that are related linguistically and culturally that make up the Dakota. You can think of them, think of a line, diagonal line between St. Paul, Minnesota and Bismarck, North Dakota. That area from east to west, we have the 7 are the Mdewakanton, the Wapakute, the Wahpeton, the Sisseton, the Yanktonai, the Yankton, and the Teton, also called the Lakota. So the people that we are concerning ourselves with here in the Red River Valley, the people who would have called the Red River Valley home in, say, 1825, are 3 bands: the Wahpeton, the Sisseton, and the Yanktonai. In this photo here, we have Tatanka Najin, as English name is Standing Buffalo. He was the high chief of the Sisseton in the 1850s, 60s. So he was a very important guy who would have known this land well. The Dakota were in the 1800s a farming culture. In this culture, it's the women who were the farmers, and Wahpeton, Sisseton, and Yanktonais, they lived in villages, year-round villages, side by side, with permanent houses made out of wood, and with surrounded by agricultural fields where they planted corn and beans and squash. And again, it was the women who farmed these here. And they lived side by side in villages at Big Stone Lake and Lake Traverse, that area. So if you think about the western edge of Minnesota, on the border, there's a little bump of Minnesota that bumps out into South Dakota. That's where they lived, on villages around there. But this was also one of the world's great horse cultures. So I mean, I would put them up there with the Mongols and the Turks and the Huns and the Dakota and the Cheyenne, one of the world's great horse cultures. And they traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles hunting buffalo, the bison, the American bison. And while they were on the move, they had portable houses. And these portable houses are called teepees. What I think is, teepees are made out of buffalo hide wrapped around large branches, sticks. Great houses on the move. And what I think is interesting about the Dakota is that people don't realize it necessarily. Maybe they don't know the name Dakota, but this is one of the world's most recognizable cultures. I think that if you ask somebody living in New Zealand or Nigeria or Nepal, what are some attributes? Think of a Native American. What they would describe would be people living in teepees with headdresses, and they'd be describing the Dakota culture. The Inuit in Alaska don't live in teepees. The Navajo in Arizona don't live in teepees. The Cherokee in Georgia didn't live in teepees. Because of, when a lot of people think about when they think about Native Americans across the world, they think about the Dakota. And so they are the people. It's simplistic to call them the people of the prairie because they also live in the woods. But around here, the Sisseton, Wahpeton, and Yanktonais, they are a people of the prairie, of the plains. The people of the forest are the Anishinaabe in this area. They call themselves the Anishinaabe, which means something like the original people, first people. We know them as the Ojibwe. And another name for them that you might see is the Chippewa. It doesn't look like it when you see the words next to each other, but Ojibwe and Chippewa are actually different ways that people figured out to spell the same word. So maybe a French guy and an English guy, maybe a French guy said that the CH the J sounds like a CH, or the P sounds like a B. But Chippewa, Ojibwa, same word. Ojibwe is, of course, a modern living language today, spoken by a lot of people. And the official spelling of Ojibwe is with the OJ, IBWE. But you still see the name Chippewa in some words, some historic words or historic titles, or old documents. The Ojibwe, I mentioned that the Dakota lived in villages next to each other by Big Stone Lake, Lake Traverse, places like that, and they traveled to this area, and they spent time up in this area seasonally. But the Ojibwe were a little different. I think that to liken them to another world culture, I haven't heard anybody else say this, but I think of it, something like a city-state, like the Greek city-states. Athens, classical Athens, it was a city of Athens, but it was also like a country. It had a realm expanding out from Athens. In the same way that the Mississippi Ojibwe, they kind of were centered around Gull Lake up by what's now Brainerd, Minnesota, but they had a realm that expanded beyond Gull Lake to around here. People, the Ojibwe bands, groups, villages that would call this area home, the land that we now call Clay County, Minnesota. There were 4 of them that could probably that would probably consider this place home. The Mississippi Ojibwe, the Pillager Ojibwe, where are centered around Leech Lake, with by modern day Walker, Minnesota. The Red Lake Ojibwe, obviously still at Red Lake, and the Pembina Ojibwe. Originally centered around North Dakota's oldest town, a fur trading town called Pembina, but now the root of the Pembina Ojibwe, they evolve into the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa by Belcourt, North Dakota, on the Canadian border. This photograph here is a Yabe Wewitung. He's a chief of the Pembina Ojibwe. His English name is Little Shell. He would have known this area well. So I mentioned that the Dakota are one of the world's great horse cultures. The Ojibwe were not originally, at least, one of the world's great horse cultures, because they were people of the forest. If you ride a horse through the forest, you get hit in the head with a tree branch and you fall off your horse. Horses are prairie animals, plains animals, steppe animals. They didn't arrive here on horses, they arrived on canoes. If you have ever been in a canoe in your life, those aluminum or plastic canoes, that is the less expensive modern adaptation of the perfect canoe that was developed by the Ojibwe and other related Great Lake tribes east of where I live, originally moving into this area. These perfect canoes were made out of birch bark. Birch bark is light, it's strong. It's light which is great because sometimes you got to carry it. Not all rivers connect to each other, and if you want to go from this area to that area, sometimes you got to cross a watershed, and so you can portage your canoe from one place to the other, one lake to a river. Also, birch bark canoes are really strong. They're really tough. I mean, birch bark is tough. I've seen people take a baseball bat to a birch bark canoe, and the baseball bat bounces off. What the Ojibwe folks are doing in this painting here is they're harvesting wild rice, or they call it Manoomin. Manoomin, Minnesota is named for this. Wild rice is a very important, delicious, nutritious food up here. And Dakota ate it too. They call it psing, is the Dakota for wild rice. Another food that important to the Ojibwe is maple sugar. Maple syrup, maple sugar, tapping maple trees in the spring, and that's what they're doing here. They don't Ojibwe don't live in teepees, at least originally. The Pembina Ojibwe would later adapt to living in teepees while hunting buffalo on the move on horseback. It was very interesting cultural transformation once they get that from the Dakota when they moved to the Red River Valley. But wigwams made out of big branches with birch bark wrapped around them would be a traditional Ojibwe house. So we got the Ojibwe, we got the Dakota. They live side by side together. They're neighbors. Sometimes neighbors fight. So their battles between the Dakota and the Ojibwe are written on the Minnesota landscape. Battle Lake, Minnesota is named for a battle. Dead Lake, Minnesota is named for a battle. So in 1825, Dakota leaders, Ojibwe leaders, and other indigenous leaders, they met in Prairie du Chien, in what is now Wisconsin, to kind of hash out who lives who. Where does your land begin? Where does my land end? And in my part of the country, at least, they said that Ojibwe country is north of the Buffalo River and north of the Cheyenne River. South of the Buffalo and Cheyenne River is the Dakota country. The Buffalo River and the Cheyenne River flow into the Red River. The Buffalo flows east to west into the Red River, and the Cheyenne flows west to east into the Red River. They both enter in a couple miles north of the Fargo-Moorhead metropolitan area, like within 10 miles north of there. So Fargo-Moorhead, the big metropolitan area, 250,000 people, the biggest city in this area, west of St. Paul, the biggest metro area, west of St. Paul, Minneapolis. This was the border. It's a historic place. So this is a photograph I took at Buffalo River State Park near Glendon, Minnesota, in Clay County. And I'm standing in Dakota territory, looking across the Buffalo River, looking at Ojibwe territory, Ojibwe land. And so I already mentioned just a couple of ways in which Dakota and Ojibwe culture and ways of life differ from each other. Another way that you can see for yourself is their languages are unrelated. You know, if you have ever taken a foreign language, like, you know, you speak English and you take German or you take Norwegian or Spanish, you know that some of these words kind of sound like each other, because if you go back far enough, English and Spanish and German and Norwegian, they're all related to each other. They're in the Indo-European language group. Ojibwe and Dakota are not related to each other. It's like English and Chinese. So, for instance, both the Ojibwe and the Dakota called this river the Buffalo River, but the Dakota called it Tatanka-Wakpa. Tatanka means buffalo, Wakpa means river. The Ojibwe called it Bijiki-Zibi. Mushkata Bijiki means prairie buffalo. Zibi means river. Mississippi is an Ojibwe word. Mississippi, it means the everywhere river. The river so big it's all over the place. The Red River, at least local Ojibwe folks called it Gitchi-Zibi, the Great River. And when a railroad corporation built a bridge over it, and towns called Moorhead and Fargo were sprouted up on either side of this bridge, the White Earth Ojibwe gave these towns a collective name. They called it Ashogema Gitchi-Zibi. So the crossing of the Great River was the Ojibwe name for Fargo and Moorhead. Although I get most Ojibwe folks called it Fargo and Moorhead, but it does have an Ojibwe name too. All right, so when George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin told the King of England that they want to be their own country called the United States of America and they don't want to be part of England anymore in 1776, they were not thinking of Clay County, Minnesota. There was no state called Minnesota. There was no county called Clay County. So this was not part of the USA in 1776. This had to become part of the USA, and it only did so in the 1850s. We could go a lot. You could do a whole. One should do a whole presentation about why and how this was, but we got to go faster here. So this land the land south of the Buffalo River, which includes the city of Moorhead. We're just south of the Buffalo River. This was the land of the Sisseton and Wahpeton Dakota and the Yankton and Nakota. And this comes into the USA in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux in 1851. They didn't have cameras back then, so they sent an artist named Frank Blackwell Mayer. And he was really able to capture in his sketchbook really the humanity and the life of the subjects that he drew at that treaty in 1851. This woman here, her name's Winona. Winona's a Dakota name, and she was there at that treaty. North of the Buffalo River, the northwest half or the northeast half of Clay County came into the USA in the Treaty of Washington in 1855 with the Mississippi and Pillager Ojibwe. This gentleman here was there. He was one of the chiefs. His name is Flatmouth. That's his English name. And he went to Washington, D.C., and while he was there, an artist sculpted him in marble. So with those two treaties, Clay County becomes part of the USA, and we have the land. That's number one. Number two, we need settlers. So there were people living here. A lot of what we're talking about is going to happen in 1871-72. Before 1871, there were towns in Clay County. There were two settlements. One was called Georgetown. It was a fur trading town for the Hudson's Bay Company, fur trading company. The other one was centered around a Catholic mission of a priest named Father Janine. And both of these towns were Métis towns. Almost everybody, with a few exceptions, were Métis. Who are the Métis? Métis is the third indigenous culture of the Red River Valley. So, gosh, I guess it was the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s. Fur traders from France and Scotland and England, they come to the Red River Valley, initially north of us, places like Winnipeg, the Red River Settlement, which would later be named Winnipeg. And they came for furs. They wanted the furs, and they came as single dudes, and they fell in love with a local girl, or they wanted to make a marriage alliance with a local family. Those local girls and local families were Ojibwe, or north of us, there's a people called the Cree or the Assiniboine, and this unique mixture of Ojibwe, Cree, Assiniboine, French, Scottish, English creates a new people called the Métis. A Métis means the mixed. Everything about this culture was mixed. You can see from this gentleman over here on the right, Maxime Marion. He wears a mix of European and indigenous clothes, like probably they would wear moccasins, Ojibwe moccasins, and French trousers, and their language was a mix of all the languages: Scottish, Gaelic, Cree, Ojibwe, French. Their language is called Michif. On the U.S. side of the border, the Métis are often called the Michif. So if you look at the census of who was living in the Red River Valley before Moorhead and Fargo were founded, most people were Métis. But a couple of Euro-American settlers started trickling in. Initially, the first of them came in 1859. There was a lot of action going on in 1859 around here in the USA side of the Red River Valley. The Red River frontier was the next place that was about to be settled. It was about to be settled, but then a thing called the Civil War happened, and the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 happened. So it took a while so settlement went backwards for a while before it restarted. So a lot of people were living here in 1859, but of those people who were living here in 1859, their lives all took them elsewhere. So the people who made their lives here and lived here and eventually died here, the first families were the men of the family. E.R. Hutchinson, a steamboat pilot from Canada, or at least the Northeast. The sources differ about whether he's a New Englander or a Canadian. Randolph Probsfield and Adam Stein were both German immigrants. Here's the women of the family. Bella Hutchinson, she is a local native, she's a native of the Red River Valley. She's Métis, grew up near Winnipeg at the Red River Settlement. Wilhelmina Stein is a German immigrant, and Catherine Probsfield was the daughter of German immigrants. And this is her and Randolph, their wedding picture in 1860. So if you have ever been to the Red River Valley in Minnesota and North Dakota, you'll notice there's a lot of Norwegians around here. This is probably the most Norwegian place in the world outside of Norway. A lot of this was the open frontier land during the peak of Norwegian immigration to America in the 1870s, 80s, 90s. So a lot of families moved out here. The first group of Norwegian pioneers of the Red River Valley, we call them the Buffalo River settlers. And this is them, a group of interrelated families and single young men who were, originally these folks come from the Fyresdal Valley of Telemark, and then they moved together through chain migration. They all end up in the Minnesota's toe, the southeast corner of Minnesota, Houston County, Spring Prairie, Minnesota. And then in 1870, they hear about land in the Red River opening up, and they say, we want to be there on the ground floor. We want our pick of the best land. And so as a group in 1870, they go out west and they pick land. They choose land along the Buffalo River, which is, it's probably about 7 miles from the Red River east. If you go between Dilworth and Glendon in Minnesota and just kind of go straight north, you'll hit the Buffalo River. That's where the families settled. That's where a lot of the families still live. A lot of people around here are descended from these families, and these families make us a magnet for Norwegian immigration, especially from. I mean, by 1890, if you're from Telemark or the Fyresdal Valley of Telemark, especially if you're going to move to America, and about 1 in 3 Norwegians move to America during these decades, you're going to move to Clay County, Minnesota, because half your family already lives here, half your hometown already lives here, and you don't even have to learn English right away. Everybody speaks Norwegian. If you're from Rollag, Norway, you're going to move to Rollag, Minnesota. That's the way it goes. So, in kind of the center, the man with the beard smoking a pipe, that's Ola Thortvedt. The woman with the plate coming up to the table, that's his wife Tona Thortvedt. And the young boy that is by the stove, his name's Levi Thortvedt. Levi Thortvedt told the story. His account is why we know of coming here when he was 9 years old, is why we know this story. It's our best source for the story. Levi had a daughter named Orabel Thortvedt. Orabel Thortvedt becomes one of our most important local historians of her generation in the 1930s, 40s. She illustrates. She's also a local artist. She illustrates this family story. These drawings and paintings are Orabel Thortvedt's telling of the family story. But we didn't just have Norwegians up here. We also had Swedes. There's still a couple of Swedish pioneer cabins that predate the existence of Fargo and Moorhead and real settlement of the Red River Valley. One of them is within Moorhead city limits itself. John Bergquist built this cabin in 1871-72. It's now right in North Moorhead. You wouldn't look at it. It's on the banks of the Red River, surrounded by. I mean, the Clay County Courthouse is real close to it, and a whole bunch of houses around it. But it looks like it's a bucolic kind of ideal country setting in this city park. Original Homestead Park is what it's called. And then just south of what would become Moorhead, Bernard and Christian Bernardson, their family came here in 1869, and their cabin still exists. They settled there, Comstock, Minnesota. Okay, so we had people living here already, and we even had a name. We called ourselves Breckenridge County. This was a really big county that comprises what is today both Clay County and Wilkin County, Minnesota. Breckenridge County, we named it for back then, U.S. Vice President John C. Breckenridge, although we misspelled his name. Breckenridge, Minnesota, the city, is also named after this man, and they also misspelled it. It continues to be misspelled. But we are not. I said this is the founding of Clay County. We are not Breckenridge County. We renamed ourselves. Why did we rename ourselves? Because John C. Breckenridge changed. He changed from being Vice President of the USA to Confederate General John C. Breckenridge. He turned traitor, and so I mean this phenomenon recently of renaming things that were once named for Confederate politicians and generals. This is not anything new. We did this 160 years ago around here. The rest of the country just catching up to us. We didn't have a whole lot of recruits into the U.S. Army during the Civil War from Clay County, from this part of the country, but there were a few, and all of them were fighting directly against General John C. Breckenridge from time to time. So he was trying to kill us. So we thought, this is too nice a place to be named after a traitor. So we scratched out the name Breckenridge from Breckenridge County, and we renamed it after Henry Clay, Senator Henry Clay, who spent his career trying to keep the country together rather than divide the country and destroy the country. So we were able to spell Henry Clay's name correctly. All right, so speaking of the Civil War, the towns I'm talking about, Moorhead, Hawley, Glendon, Barnesville, Hewlin, we were not towns during the Civil War. A real settlement of Clay County, Minnesota did not begin. What didn't happen until about 7 years after the Civil War was over. But the Civil War does have everything to do with how we were founded, the way we were founded, because the Abraham Lincoln's Congress during the Civil War was one of the most productive Congresses in the history of the United States of America. And the reason was, well, all the Southern politicians left Washington, D.C. So, I mean, we can just do a thought experiment here. Imagine that the political party in the USA that you don't particularly like, all of a sudden just left. Your team can get a lot of stuff done, can't they? Yeah. So when the Southern politicians left Washington, D.C., leaving only the Northern congressmen and senators, we really got a lot of stuff done that the Southern politicians had been blocking, because for a long time, Southern politicians were obsessed with the expansion of slavery. If it wasn't good for slavery, they weren't interested in it. If it was bad for slavery, they fought it tooth and nail. So so some of the laws that got passed were the Homestead Act in 1862. So on the left side is the Homestead Certificate for Serenius Sorensen. That's my wife's great-grandfather, settling in the Red River Valley. So the Homestead Act said if you move out to the western frontier and live on land that the government recently acquired, government-owned land, if you live here for 5 years, at the end of 5 years, you build a house, you plow some land, you make improvements. At the end of 5 years, pay a little filing fee, and we're going to give you 160 acres of land for free. That is 160 football fields for free. Now, if this was an idea before the Civil War, but Southern politicians did not want land to be given away for free to penniless Norwegian immigrants like Serenius Sorensen. Southern politicians wanted the land out west to be expensive, so only wealthy plantation owners can afford it, so slavery will expand west. Well, if you start a war against the USA and move out to Richmond, Virginia, you don't get a say anymore. You can't block it anymore. So we passed the Homestead Act, which brought a lot of immigrant families to the Red River Valley. Immigrant families that, for a fresh start, that didn't have any money. We also passed the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act created land-grant colleges. So that giving colleges lands so that they can scientifically study agriculture for the purpose of funding football teams. I kid, NDSU's Bison. Go Bison, I guess. No, I'm a Dragon. I'm a Minnesota State University Moorhead Dragon, so I went to a college. But NDSU, they're a good school. Okay, and then lastly, we got the Pacific Railway Act. So the Pacific Railway Act gave incentives to corporations, help to corporations who are making transcontinental railroads that go across the continent of North America, a railroad that would link the East Coast to the West Coast, because we didn't have a road that went from that connected the East Coast to the West Coast yet. If you go back to the Civil War, obviously we got a whole lot of people living on the East Coast in New York, Boston, Virginia, South Carolina, out to Wisconsin. We got a lot of people living out east, and we are getting increasingly more people living out in California. The gold rush was already in the past by then. We got a lot of people living in San Francisco, Oregon, but there isn't a good way to get from east to west. You could take the Oregon Trail, which is very dangerous. You're going through the land of a lot of Native American people who would prefer you not walk through their land. They don't want more white people moving out west through their land. You're going to get dysentery. We all know about the dysentery on the Oregon Trail. Or maybe more common, you go by boat. So you could take a boat, you get on a boat in New York City, you go south down to Panama, but we hadn't dug the Panama Canal yet, so you get off the boat, walk through the jungle. Half of you are going to get malaria. Some of you are going to survive it. Get to walk through the jungle to get to the Pacific Ocean side, get on another boat, get out to San Francisco. that is, either way, it's going to be months out of your life. And you're not guaranteed to survive it. So what Abraham Lincoln and Congress and everybody in the USA was saying, please, somebody build a railroad. Somebody build a railroad that links east to west. And there were a few transcontinental railroads, but the most important of them, because it's the one that applies to our local history, where I live here in Fargo Moorhead, is the Northern Pacific Railway. The Northern Pacific Railway was the idea of Jay Cooke. Jay Cooke was a really, really rich guy from out east, I think Philadelphia, and he realized he could get really, really, really richer if he built a transcontinental railroad. And it starts, 1869 is when it starts, and he figures, he's gonna start halfway there already. Duluth, Minnesota, on Lake Superior. The boats in Duluth can make it to the Pacific Ocean. You know, you go to Duluth and it's a seaport on a Great Lake. So he starts halfway across the country already. If he can go from Duluth and he goes out to Puget Sound to Seattle, then he links both coasts. He's got his transcontinental railroad. There's only one problem. There aren't any towns between Duluth and Seattle in the USA. I mean, there's Dakota people, there's Ojibwe people, there's Blackfoot, there's a lot of people there, but they're not going to buy tickets on his railroad. So how's he going to not go bankrupt? You know, spoiler alert, he does go bankrupt. They do eventually finish the railroad. But the only way this is going to work is if he brings the USA with him every step of the way. And the U.S. government's going to help. This is what it's going to look. So this checkerboard over here, this is a map of Clay County, Minnesota. And it looks like a checkerboard because it's divided up. What the Pacific Railway Act said is that if you're a transcontinental railroad like Jay Cooke, the government's going to give you every other section of land. A section of land is a mile by a mile by a mile by a mile. It's a mile square. So on this map, you look at the white map, say that's government land, blue is railroad, government railroad, government railroad, government railroad. Now you can homestead for free on government land on the white squares, but if you want to live on the blue squares, you got to pay the railroad for that. And it's going to be cheap. It's going to be like, I don't know, $1.50, $2, depending on where it is, whether you got access to water or what. But initially in the 1870s, it's real inexpensive. But this is how the railroad funds their railroad. Is they're moving west, and about every 6 miles they plop down a town. And they plop down a town. They say, okay, we're crossing the Mississippi River. We're going to call this town Brainerd. Everybody move to Brainerd here. You buy a land lot from us. That farmers move out here, buy farmland from us, and that allows us to buy more rails, or buy more ties, build more rails, pay these guys in this photo to build more track farther west. So 20 miles north and south of your proposed rail line is what the government's going to give you in Minnesota. In Dakota Territory, North Dakota's not a state yet, it's Dakota Territory. In territories, it's 40 miles north and south. That's all of Clay County. This on the right is likely the oldest photograph taken in Clay County, perhaps. This is the construction workers on the Northern Pacific Railway. And we know they are past what's now Hawley, Minnesota. They're west of Hawley because you don't see a tree. You don't see a hill. This is the Red River Valley. The Red River Valley is an ancient glacial lake bed. It is flat as a pancake. And so they're somewhere around Glendon, Dilworth, somewhere in there. Making their way to what will become Moorhead. And you don't see a tree. I find that very interesting. You drive this route now, this is Highway 10, drive on Highway 10 east coming out of Fargo Moorhead, and this is around Glendon, Dilworth, somewhere. you'll see tens of thousands of trees. Those are all put there on purpose, sometime within the last 150 or so years. All right, so I said they're going to build towns about every 6 miles or so. What are they going to? They got to come up with hundreds of names for these towns. And what are they going to name these towns after? They're going to name initially. They're going to name after themselves. Moorhead is named after William G. Moorhead. He was on the board of directors for the Northern Pacific Railway. The Fargo is named for William G. Fargo, another director of the Northern Pacific Railway. Banker guy, Wells Fargo Bank. He's the Fargo in that too. George Washington Cass is the president of the Northern Pacific Railway. About 40 miles east of here, there's a town called Castleton, named for him, in the county of Cass County, North Dakota. Fargo's in Cass County. Another one of the guys who's I think he's a later president. He works for the Northern Pacific anyway. I think Frederick Billings, a town in Montana named for him. The guy that's in charge of naming towns and founding towns, his name is Thomas Hawley Canfield. So he is the president of the Lake Superior and Puget Sound Company. So this is a the LS and PS, Lake Superior and Puget Sound Company. This was kind of like, I don't know a lot about corporate structures, but this is the Northern Pacific Railway. The Northern Pacific Railway is like focusing on building the tracks. The sub company, this subsidiary company called the Lake Superior and Puget Sound Company, they're in charge of getting people to move here and pay them so that they can build the tracks. Thomas Hawley Canfield is the guy who builds the town, says there's this town here and you guys should all move here. So they name after a while they run out of names. I mean, they name a lot of towns after railroad guys, but not everybody's a railroad guy. Not all the towns are named after railroad guys, because there's more railroad guys than you can name. There's more towns than you can name a railroad after. Eventually they start naming things after other people. Apparently somebody liked pictures of birds. So they named Audubon, Minnesota after John James Audubon, a famous painter of birds. The town of Hawley, Minnesota. You might think that it was named for Thomas Hawley Canfield, but it was not. He did not want any towns named for him. He was a modest man. I kind of like the guy the more I read about him. Thomas Hawley Canfield did not want anything named after him, so he named Hawley after his cousin. Some kind of cousin, some kind of relative. Interesting guy, though. Major General Joseph Fightin' Joe Hawley. Fightin' Joe Hawley was a Civil War hero from Connecticut. He later became a governor and a congressman and a senator. And he was once here in 1871, before there was a town called Moorhead or Hawley. Back when we were the Northern Pacific Railroad was kind of scouting out the route, he was out here kind of on a vacation. And he set up his camp about where Hawley, Minnesota is today. So Thomas Hawley Canfield named that town in his honor. And then people moved there and almost immediately changed the name to New Yeoville. New Yeoville, Minnesota. They named it after original Yeoville, or just regular Yeoville, which is in England, a town in England. Why is it named after that? Because Thomas Hawley Canfield was trying to get other people. He needed help getting people to move out here to the Minnesota frontier. So he enlisted the help of a guy named Reverend George Rogers from Yeoville, from this area. And so he advertised in local newspapers like the Western Gazette here in November of 1872, come on out to Minnesota. There is the Yeoville colony. Move out here. The soil has literally only to be tickled to smile a harvest, he says. It's true. I wouldn't put it that way, but yeah, I'd go along with that. He said, only persons of good character are admitted to Hawley. I can assure you that we have relaxed those, thankfully we have relaxed those qualifications now. I kid my friends in Hawley. I count myself among those. I think it's interesting that there was a whole section in the Western Gazette, this English newspaper, called Emigration. In America, we got the classifieds, the want ads. You want a job? You want to buy a boat? We got that section. In England in the 1800s, it's you want to move away? Go to Australia. Go to Minnesota. I find that funny. So, okay, so they renamed Hawley New Yeovil, but you would notice that it is not currently, it went back to Hawley. Why? Because the train load full of Yeovil colonists arrived in New Yeovil in April, and right into the middle of a western Minnesota blizzard. The town was not as Reverend George Rogers advertised. They did not need piano tuners and tailors. You needed blacksmiths. You needed farmers on a Minnesota pioneer prairie town. So a lot of those Yeovil colonists, they just got right back on that train and moved elsewhere. But some of those original Yeovil colonists did remain in Hawley, and they continue to live here today. But they changed the name back to Hawley. Glyndon, Minnesota is named after Howard Glyndon. Who's Howard Glyndon? Howard Glyndon is Laura Redden Searing. Why is Laura Redden Searing Howard Glyndon? Because of a little thing called sexism. You ever heard of it? So in the 1800s, 150 years ago, boys didn't want to read books written by girls because that's where cooties come from. Or at least women authors found that they did not were not able to get their books published if they had a woman's name. Laura Redden Searing was a deaf female poet, Civil War correspondent, journalist. Everybody knew Laura Redden Searing was a woman. If you read her books, they're from a woman's perspective, but she took the pen name Howard Glyndon, and she was not alone in this. George Sand was perhaps the most popular author of this generation. George Sand was a woman. The Bronte sisters wrote under male pen names, at least initially. And we still do it today. So J.K. Rowling, who was the author of the Harry Potter series, she said in an interview I read that she went by J.K. because she still thinks that there's a lot of sexism in the publishing industry today, and so she went by her initials rather than a name that sounded female. Apparently the railroad guys that that are in charge of coming up with names for towns, they like Laura Redden Searing's poetry, so they named a town in Minnesota after Howard Glyndon. Here's another fun name for you, Bogusville. Bogusville is not currently a name for a town in Clay County, Minnesota, but it was the nickname of a place that once existed, and it was the name of Randolph and Catherine Probstfield's farm. So you might remember Randolph and Catherine Probstfield as one of those early initial pioneer settler families that came in 1859, 1860. And they had to wait a long time for settlement to arrive, for the USA to catch up with them. But in the summer of 1871, it looked like USA was on its way here. The Northern Pacific Railway was building west mile by mile every day, and everybody thought that everybody had been saying for a long time that wherever the Northern Pacific Railway crosses the Red River, that's where the next great city of the West will be built. and the railway was coming closer and closer. A lot of people wanted to be on the ground floor when the railway crossed the Red River. They wanted to be the first to buy that land lot. They wanted to get the best lot, and they wanted to get it for the price that it cost on day one, because on day three it's going to be twice the price. So 400 people started gathering in tents around Randolph and Catherine Probstfield's farm. You can still go there today. Probstfield Farm. It's in Oakport, Minnesota, which is currently within the city limits of Moorhead, Minnesota. This house that you're looking at, if you take the siding off underneath, you can see the logs it's a log cabin where that Randolph Probstfield built by hand in 1868. And so about 400 people were squatting on their land, and they didn't like it. The Probstfield didn't like it. Why did everybody think that the Probstfield farm was going to be where they crossed the Red River? Is because the railroad was telling them that they were going to cross the Red River here. From the end of the rail line, the surveyors put surveyors sticks leading out to Probstfield Farm. The railroad wanted people to think that they're going to cross the river here, but they weren't going to cross here. Meanwhile, about 100 miles east of here in Alexandria, Minnesota, is about the nearest town, a guy named Andrew Holes was looking around for a guy named Job Smith. Who's Job Smith? Job Smith is a guy who had a claim of land, a homesteading claim of land, nowhere in particular on the banks of the Red River. On the Minnesota side of the river, a bit of high ground, relatively high ground. There isn't really any high ground in the Red River Valley, but it's a little bit higher than on the North Dakota side. On July 5, Andrew Holes finally finds Job Smith in Alexandria, and he pays him $2,000 for his 173.54 acres of land. It's an odd-shaped section because it's a river lot. It's a lot borders a river. This is, I don't know, 10 times what Job Smith could expect for his land. So Andrew Holes said, "Take this money and shut up. Don't tell anybody about it." And then about a month and a half later, August 28, 1871, Andrew Holes gives all that land except for 24 acres to the Lake Superior and Puget Sound Company. He gives it to Thomas Hawley Canfield. It turns out that Andrew Holes was working as an agent for the Northern Pacific Railway this whole time, and he just bought the crossing site. And that 24 acres that he didn't give to Lake Superior and Puget Sound Company, that's his payment for walking the 100 miles to Alexandria. I think you can probably you're probably one step ahead of me. Where's Job Smith's homestead? It's downtown Moorhead, and that 24 acres is located about on the corner of Center Avenue and 8th Street in Moorhead and north. So Andrew Holes becomes an important town father of Moorhead. He spends his life here, and so. About the following week, early September 1871, the Northern Pacific Railway tells everybody squatting at Probstfield Farm, "Hey, just kidding, we're not actually we're not crossing here. We're actually crossing 3 miles south of here, and we're going to call the town Moorhead and Fargo." And so overnight, all those 400 people moved to Moorhead. Moved 3 miles south, and from then on they would refer to that tent town at Probstfield Farm, they'd call it Bogusville, because they got snookered, they got fooled. This might be the earliest photograph of Fargo Moorhead. We're standing on the Moorhead side looking into Fargo on the other bank of the river. In between we got the Selkirk steamboat. The Fargo Moorhead, we used to be a steamboat center on the Red River. And this is the Selkirk steamboat. Probably one of the people on the steamboat had a camera, and they got out and they took a photo of this structure. This is the bridge that is going to create Fargo and Moorhead. The railroad still uses this bridge. This bridge now has a stone pillar in the middle of the river. It's between Center Avenue and Main Avenue. And if that bridge were 10 miles north of here, I'd live in a town called Moorhead 10 miles north of here. It's the reason this town is where it is. It's the reason the town exists. So who lived here? Jim Blanchard lived here, and what he said is that there are about 400 residents all living in tents. The population consisted chiefly of gamblers and saloon keepers. And unemployed railroad workers, guys like Solomon Comstock. Solomon Comstock, he's on the left with the top hat. He's from Maine. He was a lawyer, but he was a young lawyer, couldn't find a job as a lawyer, so he got a job. He was young and strong, so he got a job as a railroad laborer. And at the end of construction season, because it's northern Minnesota, so it's hard to build a bridge across the river when the river's frozen, and it's 20 below outside. So construction season stops at some point in Minnesota. And when it did, he said there was no road going west. I had no money to go east, so I stayed. And so did a whole lot of other seasonally unemployed railroad laborers. And also anybody who wanted the money of seasonally unemployed railroad laborers. I'm talking prostitutes, gamblers, and gunmen, people who make their living by living in a town that doesn't have any rule of law, one step ahead of the rule of law, the track end towns. Because I'll tell you, who didn't live in Moorhead. We didn't have any police officers. We didn't have any judges. We didn't have a jail. We didn't have any city council or mayor. No one was in charge. No law, no order. This is the recipe for the Wild West. So Hollywood movies would have you believe that the Wild West happens in the desert. They do this because they're cheap and lazy. In the 1930s, they built some Hollywood movie guys built a Wild West town outside of Tucson, Arizona, and it was just easier. If you're going to make a movie about the Wild West, you're just going to rent out that town and make movie after movie and TV show after TV show out there. It makes us think that the Wild West only happened in the desert, but I can assure you folks, the Wild West absolutely happened in snowy Minnesota, and it happened in Moorhead. So the other guy in this photo, his name's Jim Sharp. He said gambling and shooting were prominent pastimes for the people. A shooting match before and after breakfast was not an unusual occurrence. Solomon Comstock is an old man. He'd later say, in the bad old days, when Moorhead was a small tent town at track end, and when most of the buildings were dance halls, saloons, or gambling houses, the gunman was here too. He followed the track. He boasted that he would die with his boots on, and he usually did. The talk of his six-shooters was often heard. They walked chiefly on their own kind. Some were killed here, more on the Missouri and Yellowstone. A few reached the Rocky Mountains. So the survivors of Moorhead would later move on to the track end town called Bismarck, North Dakota. And then in 1876, those guys would move on to Deadwood. So Deadwood does survive in our Wild West imagination. So a lot of those guys who were living in Deadwood in 76 were the survivors of Moorhead in 72. So I'm going to end with telling you about one particular gunfight. This gunfight was important not because it was different, but because it was more of the same and people got fed up about it. It happened in what Solomon Comstock would call Moorhead's dark and bloody ground, but locals around here would know it as Herberger's at Moorhead Center Mall. April 25, 1872, was a gunfight between two gamblers. One of them was named Charlie Stanton. The other guy was named Dan Shumway. But we can forget their regular names because they got cool cowboy names. Shang Stanton, they called him Shang Stanton because they said that he looked like a Shanghai rooster. I do not know what a Shanghai rooster looks like. I don't know if that means he's skinny or fat or I don't know, but they said he looked like a Shanghai rooster, so they called him Shang Stanton. And Dan Shumway must have been skinny or something because they called him Slim Jim Shumway. So this was a gunfight between Slim Jim and Shumway and Shang Stanton. And there are no photographs of either of these gentlemen that exist today. So judging by newspaper accounts, I believe they look something like this. So what happened was this. Shang Stanton and Slim Jim Shumway, they're gamblers, and they get into an argument over a gambling match the night before. And they woke up in the morning. They went to bed mad, woke up in the morning, and somebody told Shang, look out, Slim Jim's gunning for you. And he's a bad dude. He just killed somebody at Detroit Lakes. So be on your toes. So it is early morning, so Shang's on his way to the bar to get drunk, to a saloon. And so he goes to the bar and he orders a drink, and behind him, Slim Jim comes up to him and he pushes him. And Shang knows who he's dealing with, so he doesn't turn around and say, excuse me. He turns around and he pulls out his ivory-handled Colt revolver, a gun that I have held in my hands. It was pretty cool. And he shoots Slim Jim in the stomach. And now this is a mortal wound, but it is not an immediately fatal wound, so Slim Jim starts shooting back. And Shang runs maybe out the door, maybe out the wall, because there weren't any buildings yet. This was a tent town. So he could have just ran out the wall and started running down the street. And Slim Jim starts shooting wildly down the street at Shang Stanton as he's running away. One of the stray bullets hits a bartender named J.P. Thompson. And J.P. Thompson's last words were something to the effect of, well, this isn't a very good place to stand. And he gets hit with a bullet and he crumples down to the floor. Slim Jim crumples down to the ground. So this is as when the dust is settling from this gunfight. It's not even dust because it's April in Minnesota, so it's mud. When the mud settles, you got 2 people dying in the street. 2 people need to be arrested. We know where Slim Jim is. He's dying right over there. But Shang has ran off somewhere. And the people of Moorhead are fed up with it. They form a mob and they go to Jim Blanchard's general store. And they said, Jim, we heard that you used to be a marshal in another town. We need somebody to arrest Shang and Slim Jim. Will you do it? And at first he says, why don't you do it? But then eventually he says, okay, I'll do it. And in doing so, he becomes Clay County's first sheriff. We got a cop. And in fact, and for the next 50 years, Jim Blanchard will be a Moorhead cop. He's a Moorhead cop in his 90s. Probably easy to run away from. All right, so we got them arrested, but now we need to put them on trial because this is the USA. This is the United States of America. You can't just put somebody in jail forever without a trial. One reason is we don't have a jail. So we got to put them on trial. So somebody remembered, hey, remember that railroad laborer guy, Solomon guy? He's got a law degree. Let's ask him to be the lawyer. So he did, to put Shang Stanton on trial. Slim Jim's dead by now, but he became Clay County's attorney to put Shang on trial. We got a guy to be a judge, David Grant. And I should say Solomon Comstock, this is his start. He becomes the most important town father of Moorhead in this generation. He become a politician, the wealthiest guy in town. He's so rich and important that he's been dead for 80, 90 years. I'm still his gardener. I check his boiler. His house is a museum in Moorhead. He's the reason why we're a college town. He gets the colleges to move here. But that's another story. So we picked these guys to put the guys on trial and arrest them from this gunfight. And then we picked 2 guys to be county commissioners, Peter Wilson and, hey, remember Andrew Holz? He's still here. And they are the ones who make these appointments official. So we have Clay County's government was created in a saloon gunfight in Moorhead Center Mall. So there we have it. We have the land, we have the settlers, we have the towns, and we have the government of Clay County. Thank you.